sanibonani babukeli, and welcome to Yilungelo Lakho. It's your right, your fast-growing consumer affairs TV show right here kumahamba phambili phela SABC 1 eMzansi for sure. Mina ngo Alisha Ntombi akajali mbukeli, khumbula ukuthi phela nani njengenjwayelo sizonivulela phela ithuba ekhambeni ngohlelo ukuthi nibambe phela iqhaza ngokuthi nishayele ucingo ku 011-714-6918 uzame futhi ku 714-6919. I-email yethu ithi consumer@sabc.co.za. Siyatholakala futhi ku Facebook na ku Twitter. Good afternoon to you. Indaba enkulu yanamhlanje mbukeli, lack of affordable accommodation in big cities has forced many people to endure squalid living conditions in neglected and hijacked buildings. Now, this problem, though common around the country, is more pronounced and prevalent in Johannesburg, where many flock to scramble for economic opportunities. While living in such harsh conditions, tenants still have to fork out for rent, levies and municipal services, which they do not often enjoy because all the money is pocketed by the building hijackers. Now, it is hoped that the right of these dwellers to decent living conditions rests on the city's battle to reclaim these dwellings.
Awungeke ukholele ukuba kuhlala abantu kwezinye zendawo ezilolu hlobo nezithe sisa kwiidolophu ezinkulu ezifana neGauteng, ukanti kubanye abantu kulapho bathi baye khona kuye kufihla inhloko. Maxa wambi abahlali simahla koko bahlawula imali eninzi. Ukunqophala kwendawo zokuhlala kunyanzelise abaninzi ukuba bancamele kobuxwayiba nalapho uninzi lwenkonzo ezifana namanzi, umbane nokuqokelelwa kwenkunkuma kwezinye zezinto esingazikhankanya ayiyonto iqinisekileyo. Oku kungenxa yokuba uninzi lwendawo zaxuthwa ngetshova kubanini bazo, yaye ezinye azihoywanga nje kuphela ngabanini bazo. Noxa abantu bahlala kuzo behlawula imali yerende ekuwa neenkonzo zikamasipala, kwabo bathi bazithatha le mali ithi ingene ezipokothweni zalamasela. Loo nto ithi ikhulele kumonakalo omninzi esingabandakanya kuwo ukungahoywa kwezakhiwo zimbi ziphela zifana nendawo yokudimbaza ubumdaka. Iphulo likamasipala lokulwa le meko selikhokelele ekubanjweni kwabantu abaliqela nabaquka igqwetha, amapolisa, onothimba kwanabantu abasuka ngaphandle. Ubukhulu becala abarenta kwezi ndawo baxhatshazwa nje kukungazi ukuba amalungelo abo aqala phi ayokumaphi, kwanokungabi nafifi lokuba kukhalazwa phi njani kubani na. Zimbalo kakhulu izikhalazo eseziye kwiziko elichophela iingxaki zabo barendayo, i-Housing Tribunal. Eli ziko likhuthaza abo banezikhalazo nabahlala kobuxwayiba neze ngaphambili. Kwelinye icala umasipala usathi gqolo nephulo lokubuyisela ezizakhiwo kubaninizo kwanokuba zibe semgangathweni wokuhlalwa, kwanokuqinisekisa ukuba abo bahlawula irente abaxhatshazwa yaye amalungelo abo akhuselekile. Nangona le ngxaki ibalasele kwidolophu yaseGauteng, iimeko zilolu hlobo zikhona kwezinye indawo. Ezi meko zokuhlala seziguqule nesimo sedolophu, yaye ezinye zezakhiwo seziyindawo apho abaphula imithetho bazimela khona. Uvuyisile Mdoda, Yilungelo Lakho.
Siyabonga kakhulu ngalo mbiko esiulethelwe nguvuyisile Mdoda. Now, to further discuss the living conditions of tenants in many of the inner cities run down buildings, let's welcome, of course, Mr. Greg Vermaak, yena ongumeli. Sibe simcelile usis Modupi, Mamodupi Mohlala Mlawuti, yena ongusihlalo weGauteng Rental Housing Tribunal. Niyazi babukeli ubekasijoyinile recently on our show but ngebhadi akakhonanga ukuthi asijoyine namhlanje. And from the city of Johannesburg, we welcome Mr. Zunaid Khan, who's going to give us, of course, the city's account on what some of the cases that, of course, they've been dealing with. He's in charge of research and policy in the city of Johannesburg Department of Housing. And, of course, from our Pretoria studios, Masamgele Usis Nomzamo Zondo, yena obuya with Socio-Economic Rights Institute, Iseri Ngamafutupi. All right, panel, a very good afternoon to you, and thank you so much for joining us on Yilungelo Lakho.
Good afternoon, thank you.
Afternoon,
thank you. Gentlemen, let's understand first the term hijacked buildings. When is a building hijacked? I don't know if you can explain, Mr. Khan.
Look, I think from a city's perspective, a hijacked building per se isn't exactly, I think Greg and I discussed this earlier, isn't necessarily when people armed come in and forcibly take over the building. That was very prevalent in the 90s in the city. At the moment, that's a bit different in how it's not to say that people who have hijacked buildings are not armed. They are. in essence, you're referring to a process where the landowner no longer has control of the building. It is taken over by people who don't have the right to do so. And they're using a form of, if you like, armed force to conduct or collect rentals from the property. There's a lack of maintenance around the property. In many ways, the property is left to degrade. There's a complete absence in payment of services or revenue towards the city in terms of rates and taxes. That's what the city would define as a hijacked property.
Greg, 1 in 20 buildings in the inner city of Johannesburg is a hijacked building. Tell us, what is the phenomenon around this?
I think my perception is that 1 in 20 is probably a little high. I think a lot of the numbers that we see referred to as hijacked buildings date back to the early 2000s, when a lot of buildings during capital flight in the 90s had declined, had been usurped, taken over, or even hijacked. So my perception is certainly not that many buildings in Johannesburg are hijacked, but there are many, possibly even hundreds, but not the numerous big buildings as took place, I think Zunaid will confirm, before. Since probably 2006, 2007, the city's regeneration programs and the business sector have recovered many of those buildings, leaving far less in what one might call a hijacked situation. But obviously the dynamic was, in terms of capital flight in the 90s, in the early 90s, the inner city was in free fall. Business was leaving Johannesburg, leaving vacant buildings. Now, people emigrated, people literally abandoned their buildings, leaving a vacuum. There was a massive urbanization taking place, not only from outside Johannesburg, but from the old townships, for example. And it's obviously a lot more convenient and potentially cheaper to live in an inner city building than in a far-flung area. So I think that was the dynamic, that there was a vacancy and a need that took place at the same time, in the moment when, shall we say, capital was moving and or distracted.
Mr. Khan, a lot of people might be under the perception that the only hijacked building is the tall structures and not necessarily the houses, but we do understand that there has been houses where the owners have actually been taken over by the tenants one way or the other.
No, that is correct, actually. And the problem's widespread. I know the show's referring to the inner city of Joburg, but in terms of the houses, you can go across the city.
Absolutely.
Far afield as Lenasia and some of the southern parts of the city, as well as in areas like Berea.
And
Yeovil as well. So this is I think as Greg is indicating, the stat there may be relatively high, but because the city's done a lot to turn this around. And in that process, a lot has happened. But be that as it may, it is a problem the city still has to address in totality, and it's in the process of doing so.
All right, and we'll get straight into how you're going to do that in a moment. Sis Nomzamo, siyabonga sisi ukuthi usijoyine la ohlelweni. Awusichazele kabanzi wena nge-organization yenu ukuthi kahle kahle yini eniyenzayo?
Ngiyabonga Salisha. ISERI, it's an NGO. Sine services ezikabili. Sinelo clinic yethu sinabameli, ngikummeli mina. Apho simela abantu abaxoshwa kumabhilidi. Ngizocacisa isizathu salokho. Isizathu ukuthi kumanje eGoli uningi labantu, about half of the people abahlala in the inner city of Joburg, bahola imali ngaphansi ka 3,200. Labo bantu labo abanayo indlela ukuthi bangakhokhe rent either to private owners, because ama private owners athi bona in terms of economically they cannot afford to rent out rooms at a rate of 700 rand or less. Meaning, for instance, ukuthi umuntu ohola 1,600 rand, ne, ngokomthetho, even understanding yethu economically, you must spend at least a quarter or a maximum of 30% of income yakho towards indawo yokuhlala, and the balance would go to education yabantwana, it would go to ukudla. So as a SERI, sabona ukuthi within Johannesburg there's a vacuum. Because ayikho indawo lapho ukuthi abantu abakhona urenta ngokusesemthethweni ngemali abakhona ukuyi-afford. So sabona ukuthi then we must actually defend abantu because akukho indawo abanoya kuyo. What we also do, we have a research wing which has done the research le ngikhuluma ngayo manje, which has actually looked at ukuthi where do these people go. So if mase ukuthi for instance umuntu kufika i-owner ithenga ibhilidi, lo muntu uhle kule building since 1990 uhle lapha for 20 years usebenza garage uhola 2,000 rand maye xoxa kule building lelo there's nowhere else where he can go unless if he goes to another building there's either hijacked or abandoned.
Sinomzamo usichazele kahle kahle lama buildings mhlambe istate sawo sinjani sisi?
Ayashiyashiyana sisalisha ne uyathola ukuthi kwamanye for instance uthola ukuthi akho ma toilet akho manzi akho gas amanye mhlambi baze basho bathi kwamnyawo amandawo awukho ugesi but mhlambi ikhonda abathola khona amanzi ama-toilet mhlamba ngawa wasebenzi but at least bawaflasha ngamabhayethi so iningi labantu kuhlala phansi kwemeko ezinzima.
Thank you, Sis Nomzamo. Now, Mr. Khan, I just want to understand, how does a building get hijacked? In what ways do these people that hijack buildings, what ethics or modus operandi do they use sometimes to hijack these buildings?
Look, I think it's a varied process. I think on some level you find where actual residents or tenants committees have got together.
All right, Mr. Khan, it's fine. We're going to hold it there for now, and you're going to answer that question immediately when we come back from the ad break. Hayi mbukeli masibambe lapho kwamanje sithi nje uthi shelele etolo kodwa ngaphambi kwaloko ithi nginikhumbuze phela ukuthi nani ngabambe iqhaza udabeni lethu ngokuthi nishayele ucingo ku 011 7146918 ungasithumela email ku consumer@sabc.co.za usithumele futhi imbiko ku Facebook na ku Twitter siyabuya khona manje. Sikwamukele futhi mbukeli ngaphambi kokuthi siqhubeke nenkulumo yethu ithi ngikukhumbuza ukuthi our participation line is there going to appear there on the bottom of your screens. You can also email us your views and comments on Facebook as well as Twitter. Mr. Khan, before we went to the ad break, you were about to explain to us how does a building get hijacked?
Well, as I said, it's a varied approach. In some instances, you find tenant committees or even residence committees form together because they realize the landlord or the owner of the property has absconded in their duty or is neglecting the property and they need it improved. So the intentions were good from that particular perspective. They decide to pool their funds, make it a collective, and then take on the management of the property. Somewhere along those lines, things change. And it becomes a greater incentive to hold on to the money. It's a mismanagement of funds, and that leads on to this larger process. The other side of this is where people find an opportunity to utilize a vacant building or property, take over and then sublet it and let it out to people and then manage it at their own accord. Obviously without the permission of the owner.
Are these abandoned buildings, Mr. Khan, that people just come in and take over and start subleasing to people?
Well, the issue or the understanding of abandoned means necessarily that possibly the owner didn't intend using it or was intending to use it for a different purpose or to renovate it. And people suddenly take over or invade the properties as the city refers to it. In that light, that's what it is. It's not necessarily that, I think as Greg was mentioning, some of the flight that took place in the 90s. The city's gone on an exercise to reclaim a lot of those buildings, track them down. It's a rather lengthy process.
Absolutely.
And then
I hear it's taken some building owners something close to a year to get their building back.
Yes.
Now, Greg, please explain to us, what does the law stipulate in terms of hijacked buildings?
The difficulty is, in essence, people will be in a position to enforce their property rights as a landowner, and I think as a consumer, if you find yourself in a hijacked building, you're paying rent to someone who maybe is not delivering any real services to you and not maintaining the building, etc. Your rights are enforceable in the courts. They are also enforceable, I think that has particular relevance to your viewers, that the Rental Housing Tribunal is a very useful organisation, and those exist in all major centres in the country, including Johannesburg. But in terms of the law, owners, which is my experience, have had very little success with the police. The police don't seem to understand the nature of building hijack, regard it as a civil matter. There is a specialist unit within the Hawks who deal with building hijacks, and they are very effective, but they're a small unit and they can't deal with all of the issues. Absolutely. So from my client's point of view, we tend to go to the High Court, get an eviction order, evict the illegal owners, in inverted commas, those who are running this business, and unfortunately frequently the tenants as well.
Let's go back to Pretoria. Sisinomzamo, awusichazele kahle kahle ukuthi wena labantu obuke wabasiza, awusichazele mhlawumbe ukuthi udaba labo bakuchazele bathi bona inkinga yabo kahle kahle bekuyini beze bezofuna usizo kwena.
Ubuningi baba bantu Alisha ne bahleli kwezibhilidi iminyaka eminingi ne I mean since ngiyenza lo msebenzi azange ngihlangana nabantu kuthiwa bafike la izolo bayakhishwa manje kuthiwa ukuthi abantu bahleli iminyaka and then umuntu omusha uthenga ibhilidi malithenga ibhilidi nje bese uGreg naye uzofika athi angisafuna umuntu omina la ngizoyirenovate ibhilidi ngirentisela abantu abasha ne and mayirentisela abantu abasha futhi urenta sebiza irent ebizayo ngaphezulu kwale abantu abayikhokhayo kumanje. That's why then uthola ukuthi then siyangenela ngoba sabona ukuthi mabesuka la abantu bazoyapi nje bengicisile qala ngathi at the moment ayikho indawo abathi ngizophuma la ngihambe ngiyokhokha irent somewhere else. Onke la company amakhulu rent sayabiza imali ezichiswa yabo 2000 something futhi bese expect ukuzokhokha futhi nama water and electricity kanjalo nakanjalo.
Sisinomzamo usichazele kahle kahle ukuthi yini kahle kahle abantu ekumele bayiqaphele before umuntu athatha ilizi mhlambe eflatini elisel hijackiwe yini mhlambe ama telltale signs ukuthi leli bhilidi sebelithathile abantu.
Ubuningi esikhathini esiningi Alisha ne uzobona ukuthi for instance ibhilidi enganakekelwa kungaklinwa kungabikho security kungabikho gesi kungabikho but uningi babantu abangena kulama bhilidi la bangena besazi but bengena indawo abangaya kuyona.
Okay, so kahle kahle uthola ukuthi labantu sisilaba aba desperate for indawo uthola mhlawumbe umuntu blacklistiwe akakhona ngisho ukuthola accommodation endaweni eregistiwe so uthola ukuthi ahamba aye kule building ngoba iyona elula.
Not even worse than that Sisalisha. Umuntu for instance osebenza kwa Shoprite umuntu osebenza kwa Fidelity security guard imali ayiholayo angeke akhona qualify for instance for uthola accommodation from umasipala themselves ngoba umasipala uzomtshela ukuthi ukuze uzorenta la irent yethu minimum yayo is 850 for instance but you must earn 3-4 times that to qualify for accommodation la.
Okay,
yabona lokho so even sometimes umuntu yena uyafuna kodwa ipocket lakhe limvumeli.
Okay, Sisinomzamo siyabonga kakhulu. Now gentlemen, I just want to understand, here's a scenario. For scenario number 1, you moved into a building, it wasn't hijacked immediately, but while you were living there it gets hijacked. What happens there? What are your rights as a tenant, Greg? Say you want to move out of this building and now these people are forcing you to actually stay there in terms of with violence and threats.
The difficulty is that the landlords, in inverted commas, in this scenario don't enforce their rights in the conventional manner through the rental tribunal, through the courts. They enforce their rights by force. So
what if the landlords as well are actually the people that have taken over the building, Greg?
Well, the landlord is normally the owner or has the authority of the owner to enter into a lease with the tenant. The scenario we're talking about where buildings have been hijacked, where you find gangs, in inverted commas, who are running these buildings, who are collecting the money entirely for their own benefit, without any kind of maintenance, without any services, no services, no rates. And what you find is, even though initially it may be appealing to a tenant because maybe there's a reduction in rent, or maybe it's cheaper, ultimately the building will decline. If it's not maintained, if rates aren't paid, the city council will become involved. Frequently ownership changes hands, the building is sold in execution, and you as a tenant, whereas you may have originally had a place to stay, that place will eventually decline and possibly even go away, and that happens quite frequently. Your rights as a tenant are to live in a place that's safe, where you have an element of security of tenure, and where you can enforce your rights against your landlord, against the lessor. And those rights are enforceable either in the courts or a lot more accessibly in the rental housing tribunals, where there is no cost to you as a consumer. And these are, there's a list of unfair practices, and the tribunal will be very quick to punish and end an unfair practice should it take place between a landlord and a tenant.
And I really wanted to know now if the Housing Tribunal manages a case well, but we'll get back into that. We're going to take a very quick ad break. Mbugeli, ungaindawo siyabuya khona manje. Welcome back mbukeli siqhubeka nendaba yethu ukhumbula ukuthi phela nawe ungasithinta nge-email ngocingo kanti na ku Facebook na ku Twitter. Now Mr. Zunaid, I just want to know something. Is the city not concerned about the hazardous effects of the living conditions found in these buildings?
The city is, to such an extent that it's a mayoral priority in the city. You know, the mayor's conducted site visits and tours through the city to take a look at this at a first hand, put the region under pressure as well as the Department of Housing and the rest of the city to address it. And I think over the years you can see the city's tried a range of different initiatives in order to address the problem at hand. Some have done progressively better than others. You know, a range of them have also resulted in inadvertent results. And within that context, the city has noted that there's a need to improve how things are done in the inner city.
Yes.
Also to understand the demand side and what's taking place. What do people need access to? And I know Nomzamo's mentioned the research done by Seri, understanding, you know, what people can afford, where does this lie? And the city hasn't failed to note that it's more than simply selling or the sales in execution or evictions. There's a whole range of other typologies that are required. And it is an exercise in understanding that what can people afford, how can the city enter into this market, and how can the city facilitate affordable rental accommodation in the city. It's a bigger wheel to turn than I think one would imagine, but it is something the city is progressively working towards.
Zunaid, the city's been busy cleaning up all the street vendors and so forth, and I suppose they are looking for that solution in terms of the buildings now, because as we saw on the inserts, the buildings downtown just look absolutely inhabitable and people are living there.
It's correct. Look, I won't discuss the informal traders thing. It's not my forte. It's another department in the city. But I think the understanding of the city is not necessarily to clean it. It's to establish management protocols. It's an exercise in urban management. And I think the city managers noted at the time that the city has failed in certain levels of its urban management, and there's a need to redress that. So you would have found there's the 10 per ward system, there's a new urban management directive, there's the fact that within that urban management framework there's a bad buildings problem properties advisory committee, which involves a range of different departments in the city, including JMPD, emergency services, environmental health and the others, to assess the nature of the buildings across the spectrum of the city, not just in inner city.
Down the buildings that are not inhabitable.
There is one side to the thing, and it has been
we saw the red ants there, and then the people move right back in after a couple of days.
Well, I think Nomzamo was asking the same thing: is where do people go?
Yes.
And I think the city's understood that. Look, it has an obligation to the poor.
Yes.
And by that same token, it needs to find ways to which the stakeholders in the city, which is not just the municipality and the poor, it includes the property owners, some of Greg's clients.
That's very true.
To share a collective understanding of the nature of what's taking place, how the city of Joburg's changed its dynamic over the past 20 years, and what's required to do that. And that's why I'm saying the city is also involved in a process with the Gauteng province, as well as the South African Police Service, to get a better understanding of how hijackings are taking place, what's the process that's required, and understand that in many instances this is also criminal enterprise.
Yes.
And there's a legal process that needs to unfold.
Yes.
The obvious scenario here, or the worst case that happens often, is the fact that in a specific building there's a range of innocent people that are caught in the crossfire of this process.
Very true.
And that's what the city is aiming to address going forward. That there are a lot of people who've come here seeking better opportunities to the City of Gold, and the city is trying to find a way to facilitate how they get access to accommodation, where they get access to it, and that's the process that will go forward over the next mayoral term.
We're looking forward certainly to that, Mr. Khan. Let's go back to Pretoria. Nomzamo, Mr. Khan ubesasichazele kancane ukuthi kahle kahle ama building ahijackwa kanjani. Wena ngokwazi kwakho sisi, please awusichazele ngesiZulu nje.
Okay. Into eyenzekayo nesisi nje bela building amaningi ashiyo ama owner aya overseas nje besisho baya ngapha kolwandle okanye abanye uthola ukuthi mhlawumbe umuntu uyashona or i-business lakhe liyashona indaba ukuthi akanamali. Manje uthola ukuthi abantu bayahlala la, okokuqala uthola ukuthi kune-committee, i-committee lithi singabahlali masihlanganiseni imali sikhona ukuthi silungise impilo la ebhilidini, sikline, sibe nama-security, sikhona ukuthi sikhokhele umasipala. Manje kulokho kuye kwenza ukuthi abantu bona la bantu abasema-committee ukuthi hawu imali eningi kangaka singayithela thina siyifake ezikhwameni zethu. inkinga yokuqala leyo iyenzeka yona but ubuningi benkinga buza kulicala lesibili engizocacisa kucala lesibili uthola ukuthi kuzoba abantu basuka ngaphandle bafike bathi bathola abantu behleli la ngaphathi building bathi thina yimi umnikazi lendawo ithengwe yimina usukela abantu ndokhokhe rent kumina uyathola ukuthi isikhathi esiningi abanye abahlali kumabili ama-building bayahamba bahambisa abantu ku-rental housing tribunal but kusibane inkinga ngokuthola ukuthi i-rental housing tribunal ayinawo amandla okuforsa labantu ukuthi baze ngaphambili kuyona uthola ukuthi esikhathini esiningi ama-case ahlehlelisele emuva and then kodwa bona this person othi uyi-owner uma nebuyezela ezokhokhisa i-rent.
All right, before ngibuyela kuwena sisasithatha uJoseph eDobsonville. Joseph usekhona elayinini?
Yes, how are you?
Siyaphila bhuti wami, sicela uqhubeke ngombuzo noma umbono.
Right. Actually, no, my comment is that I can hear the people on TV like talking about the problems that are facing, Johannesburg, housing and all that. But my comment is that the reason for that is that Joburg City, the fact of the matter is that Joburg City is neglected. Unlike, your Sandton City, you see, the city officials in Johannesburg have neglected the city. So that is the whole point. That is why you see, there's hijackings and housing problems taking place in Johannesburg. Anybody just pick up and then stay wherever they want to. So
okay.
That is my comment.
Siyabonga but Joseph, well, Mr. Khan, he says the city has basically neglected all these buildings. That is why you see this kind of behavior taking place. I think maybe we need to understand that those buildings that are also dilapidated are actually owned by other people. And I suppose the city cannot interfere on such matters by the owners.
Correct. I think you're correct in what you're saying. And the gentleman there, I understand his comment. And it may look that way, but it's exactly the nature of what you're saying. A lot of this is private property, and private property owners have a constitutional requirement to also secure their properties and ensure it is managed. But we also, as the city, understand the nature of what has happened. And that's why I mentioned that it is an exercise in urban management. There's a huge drive in the city to improve that particular service and ensure that this type of thing is arrested at some point. It may be a bad use of terms, but it is that it's arrested at some point to prevent it getting having a wide-scale effect on the city.
All right, thank you so much, Mr. Khan. Let's take a look at some of your Facebook messages. Babukele nisibhalele zona manje. Okay, asiqale ngosive emazizini kweva uthi omastandi mabaqiniseke ngawo onke amaxesha uba bana title deed yalo ndawo barentisa ngayo at Mount Freya. Thank you so much for that advice, Sive, while encouraging people that if you're going to go and look for property, make sure that those landlords have, of course, the title deeds and all legal documents pertaining the ownership of that building. Of course, Siyabonga Mngadi says, inkinga uma stand nivumelana ngento yodwa naye uma sezinshintshile izinto angabe sakutshela wena uzwe sethi kusukuzokwenzeka ukuthi manje. Basically saying that you have an agreement with a landlord, and then when things change, maybe the landlord is leaving the building, they don't necessarily update you and they just tell you, well, I'm leaving, this is what's going to happen, and they're left. And I suppose that's the plight. That's when the plight actually begins. Angelo, all right, we're not going to take any more. Owamanje Mbugeli, Yeti Sibwele Eitolo, please don't go away. Welcome back, Mbugeli. Kumbula phela ukuthi nawe ungazwakalisa owakho umbono kulolu daba esilidingidayo namhlanje. Izingcingo zethu ku-011-714-6918 uzame futhi ku-714-6919. Ungasithumela i-email ku-consumer@sabc.co.za. Siyatholakala futhi ku-Facebook kanti naku-Twitter. Sibuyele ePretoria. Sisinomzamo le cause enidefendayo, how sustainable is it, seeing ukuthi nirepresenta abantu abangenayo imali but labantu bafuna ukuhlala edolobheni?
Uyabona sisalisha ne le ohlobo yenzeka ngayo ngoku sibuyele back to apartheid ukuthi if uzoba ukuthi idolobha lifana abantu abanemali kuphela then kuzoloko kuzoba yinkinga. Ngokubona kwethu ne oqala uhulumeni wethu ne within human settlements banelento bathi ngama community rental units apho human settlements gives a grant ka 85,000 rand per household to build a unit, and then umasipala what they have to do is then top up that amount bakhe indawo ezizorenteka ngemali eaffordekayo for abantu, not ukuthi kuxolela bakuthoya abantu mabahambe bayobuyela either bayohlala emalokishini okanye bahambe bayohlala emakhaya. Nditsho ngolhlobo asisalisha ne umuntu ohlala eSoweto ne ubuninzi bakhe bomuntu lo ukhokha orenteka ngo 600 rand. Within the inner city you can't get rent for that, But then even if, for instance, uthola ukuthi lo muntu usebenza kwa-Shoprite e-Elof Street, uzokhokha i-600 rand, akhokhe futhi imali yokugibela zemsebenzini. So mawuthi lo muntu mangahlala edolobheni, kahle uthi mabuyele back emakhaya ohlala ezilalini. Kudliweni.
Thank you so much, Sis Nomzamo. Now, Greg, you wanted to emphasize something in terms of the rights. Please go ahead.
Yes, your second Facebook message made reference to entering into a lease and then the lease changes. The first thing I must mention is that if your landlord changes, if the building is sold, for example, that lease remains valid with the successor to your original landlord or your original owner. The second thing is that the Rental Housing Act and the particularly the regulations to the Rental Housing Act are very specific about what you can do with the lease. For example, you can't just increase the rental by 50% each year. There's a norm, generally maybe 10% or 8% or 12%. Those are the parameters that the Rental Housing Tribunal will use if a complaint is laid. And I can't stress enough, if a tenant, no matter what the nature of their landlord may be, they have a right in terms of the Rental Housing Act to approach the Rental Housing Tribunal, which is a very worthy organization and which doesn't cost anything. So you don't have to pay for lawyers, etc., etc. And that tribunal is, of course, also available to landlords in the hope of resolving disputes between landlord and tenants.
Now, gentlemen, I just want to understand, Mr. Khan, please take us through some of the things that are subjected to by these tenants in these hijacked buildings. I know we mentioned some services, but really give us the grey picture.
Well, look, from what we've discovered in the city, you find there's high levels of exploitation in these type of buildings, and largely for these type of tenants.
And by
everything around transactional services, people exchanging sexual services in order for rent, in order to stay in the buildings. Hijackers collecting rent twice a month. Arbitrarily evicting or kicking people out of the building with no recourse, using force often. And on many levels, we're having residents of the city living in fear. And that's why I said to you earlier, it is something the city takes very seriously. The city of Joburg is not in the habit of allowing this to take place, but it's got to find the mechanisms to address it. In the other issue for tenants is the fact that their belongings are often stolen or taken out of their apartments. People have arbitrary access to their apartments where they're staying. The tenancy can change in an instant. There can be new tenants arriving and you're suddenly removed, even if you were living there for a long time. So these are some of the things. So
you're basically living in there, you're paying, but you have absolutely no rights.
No, then there's no security of tenure. You're living on the edge effectively. And that's a term the mayor used at some point.
But Mr. Khan, you left out something very important here. In the cities, there were blind children. I mean, there were the blind, the children, babies, the elderly. Talk us through some of the health, of course, and social issues that could arise from these buildings.
Well, like I mentioned now, some of the issues are related to issues around abuse. There's the issue around the exploitation of the blind, particularly in some of the buildings where they're living in squalid conditions and people are actually renting blind people out. And that obviously is a no-no for the city of Joburg. Where kids are concerned is the hazardous conditions, there's a lack of development. And that's why I say to you here now, the city's understood that this is a highly complex situation. It is not simply about property and accommodation. There's a whole range of things and sequences that need to be put together in order to effectively address this problem.
Let's go back. Let's see some of your Facebook messages now that you've sent us through in studio. Let's see if we can have them on the screen. Yes, there they are. The best thing to do is to buy your own house, then renting in order to avoid this situation. But if you don't qualify to buy a house, you have no choice. You must rent. Yes, thank you for understanding that, George. And of course, Nombuyiselo Zulu says, what must I do before renting? Are there any procedures to follow before renting? Mr. Greg, that is what is all yours.
Yes, I think the Rental Act, all the regulations are in the process of being changed to require a written lease. Historically, you don't have to have a lease in writing, and in theory, a verbal lease is as enforceable as a non-written lease. But we know what happens. if it isn't recorded in writing, there's going to be a divergence of opinion of what it was. So I think in general terms it's important for a landlord and a tenant to have a written lease which dictates the rental, when it must be paid, what the obligations are of the tenant, what the obligations are of the landlord. There's generally not too much complexity in that. And then obviously in the context of your viewer's question, being certain that the person who is letting this property to you has the right to do so. In most instances they will have. But you can check the authority. You can ask them for a copy of the title deed, as the previous Facebooker mentioned, and I'd say that would be the way to do it. But
Greg, what about these desperate people, as I mentioned earlier on?
Yes.
Maybe of them they can't afford, better housing. They're obviously probably blacklisted,
yes,
or for certain reasons they can't qualify for the normal procedural lease.
You're quite right, and I think that's where the Johannesburg inner city problem has come from, where it's informal. It's the informal sector, and you have a very regulated and efficient formal sector in which there are hundreds of thousands or millions of participants, but then you have this informal sector as well, where people are prone to exploitation. It's very difficult to say what to do about that. It is a social problem. I think it's a social reality of South Africa. I don't know what the answer is. Suffice it to say that even with a very informal landlord-tenant relationship, the rental tribunal will intervene if there's a problem, and they will do so quite emphatically.
All right, let's go back to Pretoria. Sisinomzamo, yini mhlawumbe ongacebisa ababukeli ukuthi if besuspect ukuthi mhlawumbe labantu sebethatha ibuilding bafuna ukuthi benze something without these people finding out, ukuthi balithola kanjani usizo, beza kunina kuqala bangenza njani?
Into engcono sisalisha ukuthi baye kwi-City of Joburg nje bethile uZunette kanti ukuthi bane department that is deal specifically with the hijacking, okanye baye kwi-Provincial Department of Housing apho khona bangathola khona usizo ngalokho. But inkinga ila sisalisha kakhulu for isikhathi esiningi uhulumeni kunye nomasipala segoli indaba ya building hijacking bayibheke purely from iside ukuthi ibuilding libe clean, bakhohlwa ngabantu. So thola ukuthi labantu bayaza bathi le building ihijackiwe, iowner yangempela iyafika, manje akusekho umuntu ozobasiza bona, sibona sebeme ngaphandle balala endleleni abasendawo zokuhlala.
Thank you so much, Sis Nomzamo. Mbukeli asibambe lapho kwamanje futhi siphinde sithi shelele ngaseyitolo ungayindawo. Welcome back, Mbukeli. Can you believe it? This is our final segment. It is Putumege Sifunde ama Facebook messages and Nistumele Wona Nangu Upo Joni Sebotumuti. Hi guys, it is very difficult to have a comfortable and cheap accommodation near working place. We try to avoid staying in shacks and kasis and run to the cities where you find yourself sharing a small room with 4 people and paying equal rent instead of sharing it. Now the worst part is you find out that there's no hot water and its toilet are in a bad condition. Johnny, thank you so much for that. To Koli Costa Yantla, our last Facebook message for today, says, hi guys, my dad left his flat with a tenant and went back to the rural areas after getting his package. Now the tenants are claiming that the flat is theirs. Please help, I'm destitute. Greg.
Well, I think the first one is very correct. In fact, it's been suggested that we don't have an accommodation problem, we have a transport problem.
Yes.
Because obviously inner city accommodation is expensive for the council as well as for individuals. It's a lot cheaper to accommodate people in large numbers further out of the inner city. Then, of course, you have the transport problem. With respect to your second Facebooker, it's a difficult one. Clearly, these guys have now taken over the property and they're saying it's ours and you can go and whistle. Unfortunately, he's going to have to evict them. Unfortunately, again, there's a legal process attached to it. The police will not assist. The rental tribunal is unable to issue eviction orders. So
it's a court order, Greg?
You would need a court order. It's against the law to evict somebody without a court order. The difficulty is it's time consuming and it of course can be expensive.
And this man went back to the rural areas. But the person that, I'm sure the son or the daughter can, of course, relay this message. What can they do, Greg, in this situation? The best tips?
Well, I don't know their means. I must assume that they may be of limited means, in which case maybe one of the legal aid bodies will be able to assist them. I think they do need an attorney. I think they do need to speak to someone who can get an eviction order for them. Unfortunately, it has. There's almost no method of resolving this short of obtaining an eviction order.
Mr. Khan, you can't even send in the red ants.
No, we can't actually. As Greg is indicating, you need an eviction order. The city would require the same. And I think his advice is correct. And I think related to what your first Facebooker was stating, the issue, and Greg is mentioning the issue around transport.
Yes.
You would have seen the city has driven a concept recently called the Corridors of Freedom.
Yes.
And it's about linking the city across end to end through these different corridors and providing those opportunities and nodes and having this multinodal approach.
So it's going to ease the burden a little bit.
It is that. I think eventually the inner city also reaches a certain carrying capacity.
Absolutely.
And we have to be mindful of that. The other is you don't want a single-use environment.
We don't want to be sharing a flat with 5 people, one room with 5 people.
Informal rental sector at the moment in the inner city is the most expensive rental in the country. Some of that informal rentals going at 100 rand a square meter. So I can understand the dynamic.
All right, and of course Mbukeli usengasishayela ucingo ngokushesha okukhulu ngoba phela sesizovala uhlelo. Masibuyele ePretoria sisinomzamo sesovala uhlelo sisi awusichazele kabanzi ukuthi amalungelo alabantu abazithola sebekulama building ahijackiwe sisi basizakala kanjani. Yini into yokuqala nje umuntu ekumele ayenze? Uyapi uthini kubani?
Sisalisha kuyinkinga ne nje bengisho ngithi umasipala umanje angazi nje uzunide besa explain ukuthi bayazama ukuthi bacabanga ukuthi bangenza kanjani ngabantu abazibona bekuleso simo. Kumanje akhonda apha bangaya kuyona ne kodwa thina lesino advisor kokuqala ukuthi umuntu umele ukuthi ahamba ayo apply for indlu ye RDP kuye provincial office yase kulondawo akuyona. Okwesibili ukuthi if uthola ukuthi manje seniyakhishwa akhona ama organizations afana nawethu ababamela abantu abakhishwayo. If ever ubona ukuthi mhlaba awukhona ukuthi awuna family onaya kuyona ikusize or awukhona ukuthi ungathola indawo ye rent apho ngoya afford, then kulapho ngaza kuthina uzositshela ukuthi hayi ngingulomuntu ngihlala kule ndawo and ngiyakhishwa, then sizokhona ukumela mase kunjalo. Kodwa umthetho la umgaqo sekho la eSouth Africa u very clear sisalisha ukuthi umuntu phambi kokuthi akhishwe inkantolo kufanele kube involved nje bese beshilo nabanye futhi inkantolo izocabanga ukuthi vele if uyakhishwa uzoya kephi.
Okay, sisinomzamo. So sisinomzamo abantu bangaqala uya advise ukuthi kahle kahle baqale baye police station before befika or baye kuyo iCity bayo reporta ama cases wabo because bane department njengoba ubusushilo.
Lokho kungaba ungcono sisi.
Okay. All right. Now, gentlemen, moving forward, what are some of the solutions, Mr. Khan, that we can look forward to from the city?
All right.
Big improvements.
They are. Look, I think it's important to note that this is a big wheel to turn. The city has done a lot. And what we've understood now is, I think, with the work of Siri and a range of others in the field, and some of Nomzamo's other colleagues, is to understand the demand side, particularly what is it that people can afford, what is the rental or levels of rental that's required. And you would have seen post the Growth and Development Strategy 2040 that the city did. The city's done a Sustainable Human Settlements Urbanization Plan for the same time frame.
All right.
And it's to understand the drive towards rental accommodation because the census data is indicating the same.
So you have these people in mind. It's
we
been
do,
in the work.
And it's to understand what's the typology that's required, what can the city deliver, how can it deliver, and within that affordable sector, how would you facilitate this, whether it will be the private sector to get involved or the state funding it on its own. So all these processes need to be ironed out, if you'd like. But there is a distinct drive over 30 years to say there's a need for a greater supply of affordable rental accommodation in the city of Johannesburg so that people don't have to enter hijacked buildings. They can live in better managed, more formalized rental, but at the same level so they can. The other thing you would have noticed, I think, is even from a transport perspective, is this drive towards public transport, the Ria Via and the BRT. You would have also seen that BRT has reduced its tariffs to a flat rate of 8 Rand to improve people's access to the system so you can get a high quality public transport system. Although it's not fully rolled out, it will get there, but you can get it for an 8 Rand flat rate across the city. So these are some of the things attached to, as I mentioned, the corridors of freedom to move to have development take place across the city, link up the city, so that people don't find that the inner city is the only place they can access accommodation.
Yes.
And they can do it across the city.
Thank you very much, Mr. Khan, for those words. Big improvements, well, that we can expect from the city. Sisinomzamo ngicela nje uvalelise unikeze ababukeli advice yokugcina very quickly.
Ngiyabonga kakhulu Sisalisha. Nje bengishilo le siyacela ukuthi abantu if bathola ukuthi bathola ama notice ukuthi bayaxoshwa abazi ukuthi bazoya kiphi basheshe bahambe baye kundawo ezingabakhona basiza ama office ama legal aid board kuma NGO afana na iSeri abo Center for Applied Legal Studies abo Legal Resources Center bangathola ukuthi bazithola sebehleli ngaphandle ama stepsini benethwa imvula nengane ezincane. Ngiyabonga kakhulu ngokusho ngokuzunate about ama plans kamasipala itself kodwa siyancenga ukuthi basheshise ngama plans wabo ukuthi benze ukuthi ube khona ngempela indawo ukuthi abantu bazakhona ukuhlala kuzona ngempela abazokhona ukuyikhokha.
Siyabonga kakhulu Sisinomzamo ukuthi ube nathi ohlelweni namhlanje.
Ngiyabonga sis.
Thank you so much. Greg, very quickly, your final words to our viewers.
I think there's no reason why a tenant should be exploited. I think there are sufficient mechanisms built into the system to assist them at no cost. The tenants need to know that
they have rights in the first place.
They do have rights. Their rights are backed up by law and by the structures of the state. And these organizations are very willing to assist them and do assist them in large numbers on a daily basis.
Gentlemen, thank you very much for your insightful knowledge right here on the show. Thank you very much. Well, Mbogeli masibambe lapho njengoba phela sesishiwe isikhathi. I would like to thank my studio guests for making time to be here as well as for their valuable knowledge. Siphinde sibonge nani babukeli phela ngokuthi libe nathi kuze kube manje. Please do join us next week Friday for another live consumer topic of the week. Mbogeli ukhumbule ukuthola impinde ezinhlelo zethu. Join us every Monday morning khona la kumamba phambili SABC 1 eMzansi for sure from 10 o'clock to 11 o'clock ukuthola impinda Yilungelo Lakho. For myself, Alicia, Intombi Akajali and the rest of the team, nisale kahle. Goodbye.
Yilungelo